Salutations and welcome, horse racing fans. My name is Matthew DeSantis. You can find me on Twitter at the handle at Menace, and I am your host today for the Win Place Show, a conversation show and program all about horse racing and handicapping that is proudly part of the Trust the Profits YouTube network. And like I said, make sure to follow me on Twitter at the handle at Menace, and make sure to subscribe to Trust the Profits for all of our great content, whether it's the Win Play Show, whether it's Daily Doubles, whether it's the Countdown to the Derby, which is already getting started, whether it is the previews of the different stakes races, whether it's capping the card, whether it's some of the live streams that we're doing. There's so much content, so many different folks are tuning in. Really cannot go wrong subscribing to Trust the Profits. We really do have something for everyone. Really thrilled that you're here joining me today as we run down the Win Play Show episode 4. And what are we going to talk about? Well, there was a lot of racing that took place over the Thanksgiving holiday and over the Thanksgiving weekend. So we're going to recap some of that information, bring you up to speed with some new information that's impacting some of the tracks that you might be looking to play in the coming months, and then also highlight a couple of the races that are going to be coming up this weekend. And we'll be able to go into a little bit more detail about that moving forward. But let's start where we always do, which is looking back at what we learned this past weekend. And lesson number one of what we learned this past weekend was the 3-year-old Eclipse Award is all wrapped up, folks, and it's going to Epicenter. That is, or I think it's going to go to Epicenter. I think it's all wrapped up now. Maybe Taba goes out, wins the Malibu. Maybe there's a case to be made for Taba over Epicenter. But I think that what we saw this past weekend was that Rich Strike, I should say, who ran in the Clark, did not run particularly well. And so he was a horse that obviously has generated a lot of buzz. He's a horse that has generated a lot of conversation, a lot of debate. You have people who absolutely love this horse and will defend this horse until their dying breath. And you have people who are completely on the other end of the spectrum and think this horse is a complete fraud. And it was a once in a lifetime setup for him at the Kentucky Derby, and that he will never replicate that again. I guess I fall somewhere in the middle. I don't know. Maybe that's the nature of me having taught political science for 15 years in my career. I tend not to gravitate towards extremes in either case. I tend to be a little bit in the middle. I see both sides. I understand why people love this horse. He's a working class horse in a lot of ways. Obviously, the connections are not the Baffert, the Pletcher, the Asmussen, the Brown, the big names in the sport. Eric Reed, smaller barn. Obviously, a lot of tragedy in terms of the barn fire that really ravaged his barn of several years back. And so there's a wonderful underdog story there. And Rich Strike has proven to at least be able to run effectively in some races subsequently. Obviously, running second in the Lucas to Hot Rod Charlie, fourth in the Travers, fourth at the Breeders' Cup. But coming back in this Clark race, this was his attempt to get a grade 1. This was his attempt to get another win, quite frankly, on his resume after the Kentucky Derby. And it just didn't happen. And everything was set up for him to be able to win this race in a lot of ways. I mean, if you believe in speed figures, he was by far and away the class of this field from a speed figure perspective. But, and there's always a but, the thing about Rich Strike is that he is a dependent horse. He is not a horse that can make his own race. And that's always been one of my critiques of Rich Strike, which is unlike a horse like Epicenter that can kind of make his own trip. Rich Strike needs a fast paced up front and something to close into. Now, Epicenter can close into things, but he can also sit on the lead. He can also stalk. He can do a lot of different things. He's a versatile horse. Rich Strike is not a versatile horse. He's a one-note horse. Now, it's a hell of a note when it rings true, but to that extent, Mind That Bird was a one-note horse. You could make the argument that a horse like Zenyatta was a one-note horse, that big sweeping move. But Rich Strike needs the pace. And It just didn't happen in the Clark. It wasn't a glacial pace, but it certainly wasn't an overwhelming pace. Also, it emerged that he had a fever after the race had been run. He had gotten scoped, Eric Reed said, and turns out that he had a little bit of a fever, so was not necessarily feeling up to his best in this particular race. But obviously, not the sort of performance you'd like to see, finishing, I believe, last or second to last in that Clark race. The winner ultimately was Proxy. Now, the interesting thing about Proxy is Proxy had never won anything more than an allowance race before. But Proxy had always been sniffing around the winner's circle in these stakes races. Now, this is a big, now grade one winner for Proxy. So very big for the connections, very big, obviously, for siring fees, etc. But Proxy moving from an allowance winner to now a grade one winner. Big jump this past weekend for Proxy. But like I said, I think the takeaway from the Clark is that the Rich Strike discussion around him being the horse of the year can quietly go into the night. I think now it makes all the sense in the world to name Epicenter that 3-year-old of the year. And, I think, some people will point to Taba. If Table wins the Malibu, maybe that might happen. I mean, it's a muddled year for 3-year-olds. I think Epicenter is clearly the top class of the 3-year-olds, but I hear other arguments and I understand them. I don't discredit them out of hand. The Rich Strike argument never made much sense to me, but this one will obviously go down as being a race that really, like I said, put him on a different trajectory maybe, because if he wins this race going into his 4-year-old year, maybe he collects the hardware for 3-year-old champion. Maybe a lot more is in store. I think now is maybe a little bit back to the drawing board. There still is talk of him going to Dubai next time out. We'll see. The other thing to remind, this was a quick turnaround from the Breeders' Cup. This was a point that Matt Dinnerman, who makes the calls out of Golden Gate, this is a point that he made, was this is now a trend of horses who run against Flightline who do not run well next time out. And you saw it with Speaker's Corner, obviously, who now just looks, I mean, basically has just been retired after running against Life is Good and Flightline over the summer. But we've seen this with other horses. Country Grammar ran a very distant second and then ran a disappointing second the next time out. You've seen this happen with horses that just try to run at that pace, and it's just so much. It was also a quick turnaround. Like I said, 3 weeks basically from the Breeders' Cup to the Clark. So this was a quick turnaround for Rich Strike after a really grueling race in the Breeders' Cup Classic. Like I said, from a pure numbers standpoint, he was clearly the class of the field, should have won this race. From a betting perspective, obviously a lot of support behind him, was the betting line favorite, if I'm not mistaken. It was very close there at the end between him and West Willpower. And so it'll be interesting to see, like I said, how he continues to run as a 4-year-old. But at least he's one of the few coming back as a 4-year-old. So I tip my cap to him for doing that because we need more horses in this older dirt division. So let's move away from the Clark and let's focus on a few of the other races that were run this past weekend. We'll start with the Cumley, and that was a really fascinating race up at Aqueduct. The 63 caliber, the winner in this race. Great trip, stalked the pace the whole way around. And sometimes it is as simple as betting Gunrunner. Of course, another one of the great Gunrunner progenies. And so that was a big win for trainer Tom Amos. This is the second consecutive stakes win for 63 caliber, who is a My Racehorse horse, I should point out, and won a listed stakes race last time out, now stepping up and winning the grade 3 Cumley. Finishing second in that race was Kathleen O. Now, anybody who's ever followed me on Twitter at Failed to Menace knows that I love Kathleen O. I think she's a really special filly. Loved her on the Oaks Trail this past year coming out of Gulfstream Park. Ran 5th in that Kentucky Oaks race, which was not as bad as it might seem on paper. She was really far back early and just couldn't quite make up the ground late. But she had been laid off for 7.5 months between that Oaks and now running in the Cumley. Runs a really, I thought, a game second place, was a neck behind 63 caliber at the wire. I think there's a lot of reasons to suspect Kathleen O is going to run even better next time out. Shug McGahee, her trainer, is someone who notoriously lets horses run into shape. Second off the layoff, third off the layoff is a very typical handicapping angle for Shug McGahee horses, particularly when going 2 turns on the dirt. He doesn't have a bad trainer stats off layoffs, but when you look at specifically 2 turns on the dirt, he's only winning, I want to say, about a 4% rate on winning off the long layoffs. So he's a horse, again, he's a trainer that'll let the horse run into shape a little bit. And the reason I say that, she didn't have that push button move that she normally has. Typically, she's someone who, they shake the reins and she takes off. Didn't really see that from her, didn't see that explosion. What you did see is her kind of grinding away at 63 caliber and making up ground, making up ground, making up ground. And so I thought it was a positive effort. We'll see. I'd imagine she'll ship back down to Gulfstream Park for the winter, but you never know where Shug will point her next. But I think a positive overall comeback for Kathleen O, finishing second in that race. Well, one of the other races that were taking place over the weekend was down in Kentucky, obviously at Churchill Downs, and Delika winning the Cardinal Stakes. And the reason I wanted to bring this one up was obviously Churchill Downs has had all sorts of trouble with their turf course, not being able to run on it, the grass not taking, not being rooted, etc. It just has been a disaster, one step after another, and rather embarrassing for supposedly the crown jewel track in North American racing. Not being able to grow grass properly. It's something I can do outside my front yard, but apparently we can't do it at Churchill Downs. So I know it's a little bit more complicated than me planting grass seed in my front yard, but still, it's not a good look, admittedly, that they're not able to get this done. And so one of the things that we noticed was, and I noticed this obviously in the spring along with a lot of other people, was that certain types of horses tended to benefit from the really unique turf at Churchill. That really, I mean, like I said, David Aragona, the morning line maker for New York, jokingly referred to it as Churf, the Churchill Downs turf. And Churf, if you will, is not particularly deep. Somebody said it's like running on spray painted pavement. And there's an element to that. It's not your typical turf course. And so Santon is a horse that ran really well there in a couple of instances at Churchill Downs on that turf. And then you wonder, well, how does that translate if he gets off that turf? And it's not translated particularly well. Delika, very similar. That's a funky turf. I like Delika as a horse quite a bit, but something to keep in mind from a handicapping standpoint, looking at these Churchill Down turf races, and in some cases, just drawing a line through them and going, maybe I'm going to ignore this race. Maybe I'm going to look at past form, particularly if that Churchill effort is a little anomalous, is a little bit different than everything else coming before and after it. So just something to keep in mind. All credit to Delika for winning the Cardinal, but as Churchill is still dealing with this turf, I think it's something to keep in mind. Now, the other big race was at the Kentucky Jockey Club at Churchill, and this was won by Instant Coffee, a horse that I think a lot of us liked quite a bit. Instant Coffee is a good horse that was in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and really impressive bounce back. Obviously, 3 weeks later, comes back, and one thing that's obvious is this year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile is coming back extraordinarily more powerful than last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile, because last year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile featured almost no return winners and certainly no next out winners. And so Instant Coffee coming out of that field, finishing fifth in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and now coming back and winning the Kentucky Jockey Club on 3 weeks rest. Really impressive there for Instant Coffee. So that's certainly one that you really got to put a little bit of a bullet mark next to Instant Coffee. I think is a horse that, is already sniffing around next year's Derby Trail. Of course, last year, everybody pointed towards the Kentucky Jockey Club as being really the best indicator of success in some of the Derby prep races. That was a very, very strong race that had a lot of great horses that came out of it that ran really well in the Derby Trail, White at Barrio, and among others. And so having Instant Coffee win this, something to keep an eye on. It was a very thrilling finish. He kind of emerged from the pack. Really, I thought a gutty effort. It really, especially on 3 weeks rest, being able to pull away from the rest of the pack that last half furlong. Love the effort there. Also love to see the Bolt Doros stretching out. Instant Coffee is a Bolt Doro prodigy. Bolt Doro's had a ton of success early when a lot of his progeny were sprinting this year. And this is his first crop, obviously. they've cooled off a little bit as they've stretched out. And so it's nice to see the Bolt Doros now having a little bit of success around 2 turns in a big spot. So always like that. And part of the reason is I actually one of my former students, believe it or not, at the University of Texas El Paso, helped train Bolt Doro. So I'm always a sucker for that horse because I have a connection to that horse through a former student that I had. So I love seeing the Bolt Doro crop now and progeny being successful in this spot. Well, those are some of the race recaps from this past weekend, but there's still some other racing news, and that is taking place on the course. And that is particularly focused on turf. We were just talking about the turf at Churchill Downs. Well, there's another track that's not going to be running at all for a little while, and that is Fairgrounds. That's right. The Fairgrounds is going no turf until at least mid December. And based upon the pictures that I've seen that have been posted on social media, I can't imagine things are going to be better in mid December. The turf there looks absolutely atrocious and abysmal. And there just appears to be an absolute epidemic among tracks that just can't seem to plant grass properly. And it is just, like I said, really embarrassing that you're not seeing any of these turf races getting all of them taking off the card on at the fairgrounds until, like I said, at least mid December. The photos that I've seen have looked, like I said, very, very bad. I would be shocked if the turf made a turnaround by mid December. Maybe they cut off the inside, maybe they kind of let them run more on the outside of the turf course because the inner rail is just unrunnable right now. I mean, just completely. And the inner rail is the biggest problem. And so maybe they just start the races a little further out. That's a possibility that they could maybe get to by mid-December, but no turf at the fairgrounds. Now, some people do know how to plant grass. South Florida, apparently. Say what you will about Gulfstream Park, and nearly everyone has an opinion about that track, but at least it seems like they've been able to effectively grow grass. The new turf course is ready for debut for the championship meet coming up and is already getting a lot of cards, a lot of carded races for that turf course at Gulfstream Park. Of course, that means not as much Tapeta, not as much of the synthetic. Now, that's a sad day for me personally because I loved the synthetic and I loved the Tapeta. I, for some reason, I could figure out how to handicap that surface very quickly. I didn't think it was that difficult to handicap. Everybody else was flipping out over it. It was just one of those things where it was a little funky early on. One of my good friends who's been on the program before, Barry Spears, has always said about Tapeta and synthetic surfaces, they're a little bit like a baseball glove, that the more you run on them, the more they get worn in, the better they get, the more honest they get. There was some significant track bias early on at Gulfstream Park in the Tapeta, but it was one of those things. It was clear as day that you did not want to be in the lead, and you also didn't want to be a deep closer. You always were looking for horses that were sitting like second through fourth in most instances at the running lines, and so it wasn't that difficult sometimes to figure out where you needed to look on the Tapeta, but obviously there will be fewer races there on the Tapeta. But I love the Tapeta because I love the fact that Gulfstream has all three of these surfaces so that if you go off turf, because of course there's always the thunderstorms in South Florida, if you go off turf, you can still run on the Tapeta. You can still run on the all-weather track. That's much more form-fitting for a lot of these turf horses. You hopefully will avoid as many scratches taking place. So I like that we have all three options there at Gulfstream Park, but the brand new turf course looks absolutely beautiful and picturesque. So excited for turf racing at Gulfstream Park, hoping that turf racing can eventually return to the fairgrounds once they get that grass growing in the right direction. Well, let's look ahead a little bit to next week. And there's some big races coming up here in the first weekend of December, particularly at Aqueduct. And if you want to get more information, wait until my capping the card, where I will run through every single race at that Aqueduct card this weekend. And so I'll give you my top play as well as my top value pick in every single race from 1 to I think 12. I think there's going to be 12 races on that Aqueduct card this weekend, but I'm going to cover all of them in my capping the card segment, and that'll be out on Friday morning. So make sure to check that out when it drops. Also, we already have a preview of the Cigar Mile up on the Trust the Profits YouTube page, so make sure to check that out as we have a full field rundown. But that's where we'll start with the big races this weekend. The big grade one that's on the card is the Cigar Mile, and a really interesting field. Obviously, Zandon, White Abarrio, Baby Yoda, Obesos, Mind Control. Now, it will be Mind Control's final race. That has already been announced. Uh, but I think you have to look at kind of Zandon and White Abarrio as your two most likely winners in this particular race. White Abarrio, I'm maybe a little less cool on. You know me, I'm always on the simplification train. So I'm always on the other horse from Florida in terms of me liking simplification. White Abarrio, very good horse, and I love the connections. Absolutely love the ownership group, C2 Stables. I cannot say the amount of great things they do for horse racing and for horse racing aftercare. And so White Abarrio is a horse that is very easy to root for, and whose connections, at least in terms of the ownership group, very, very easy to root for. And I like Safi. I know a lot of people give Safi Joseph a little bit of crap. I like Safi Joseph a lot. But Zandon, hard to get past the pure black horse and the just a beautiful, beautiful horse. I remember being at Parks for Pennsylvania Derby, and Zandon walked by, and some woman standing next to me goes, "Oh my, I've never seen a more beautiful horse." And it's true. I mean, Zandon is one of those horses. You do a double take when you see him in the paddock. I mean, he looks just a million. He looks more than $1,000,000 because he is $1,000,000. I mean, he looks the part. And so this will be a big effort for him. Zandon's a horse that a little bit of a midnight bourbon element, kind of has that hang in him, kind of has that finish underneath all the time. So being able to get a big win here would be huge for him, cutting back in distance, obviously, in that Cigar Mile. Baby Yoda, a horse that my dad absolutely loves. We'll see how he runs here. I'm not usually super confident in a horse like Baby Yoda in this spot. I think he's better at kind of listed stakes races. This is kind of a big spot for him. Obesos, horse that was, of course, ran in last year's Derby, has come back, had some success. Always like to see him coming back and running well here. And obviously, like I said, Mind Control in his final race. A couple of other races at Aqueduct this past weekend. The Demoiselle is going to be coming up this next weekend. And I'll be honest, you should probably be paying attention to who's running it, because the last two winners of the Demoiselle, Nest and Malathat, hard to get better than those two the last 2 years. We'll see if there's a horse of this caliber that will end up, kind of marching towards the Oaks Trail kicking off. Speaking of the trail, the Derby Trail, the Remsen is the other big stakes race up there this weekend. I'll tell you a horse to zoom in on. It's Tuskegee Airman. That's a horse that broke his maiden at Parks on Pennsylvania Derby Day. Saw him in person. He was supposed to run his maiden at Saratoga, but it got rained out. And so he ended up coming to Parks to run that race. And I mean, just looked dynamite. Beat a horse like Didinger, who went on to win, I think, by 11 and a half lengths next time out at Parks. And so was a dominant effort there for him. And Didinger's come back and run well. And of course, Tuskegee Airman came back and actually won a listed stakes race after that maiden effort. So now looking to run in that Remsen. Of course, last year, the epic duel between Mo Donegal and Zandon. We'll see if there's high drama in this year's Remsen. Well, I'm going to finish up things by talking about a horse that may not beat Flightline for Horse of the Year, but gosh darn it, may just have won all of our hearts and may win that Vox Populi award, and that is Beverly Park. For all of the things we can say about horse racing, for all of the consternation I've heard about Flightline and his limited career and only running in the 6 races, Beverly Park has run, get this, in 28 races this year. The year is, we're not even into the last month of the year. 28 races. Here's the real kicker: 13 wins. Overall record thus far in 2022, 28 starts, 13 wins, 6 seconds, 3/3. That is 22 for 28 in the money. And here's the thing: this horse is not slowing down. Beverly Park has won 4 of its last 7 races. Absolutely incredible. Like I said, a horse of the people, a horse that is a super big throwback horse. This horse clearly does not mind the short layoffs. I mean, this horse is basically having like 2-week layoffs in between races, but continues to run well. The horse doesn't show fatigue. The horse doesn't seem like it's bothered by this more aggressive schedule. And if you talk to horse people, they will always say every horse is different. Some horses are able to bounce back, come back very quickly. Other horses take a long time to recover from a particular race. Beverly Park can clearly come back and has no problem. You want to hear an even more impressive list? Here are the 13 tracks that Beverly Park has run at this year. Get ready for this: Oaklawn, Charlestown, Turfway Park, Laurel, Mahoning Valley, Keeneland, Monmouth, Belterra, Thistledown, Delaware Park, Colonial, Timonium, and Churchill Downs. Anybody who's got Timonium and Churchill Downs on their resume, I love that combination. So, tip of the cap to Beverly Park, who just won this past weekend at Mahoning Valley. 13th win of the year, 28 races, a horse of the people. Good for Beverly Park and good for all of the connections. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Win Place Show. Make sure to check out our next episode, which is dropping tomorrow. It's going to be all about HISA, the horse racing integrity entity that is trying to potentially corral or at least oversee the horse racing industry and some of the legal barriers that have recently come up. Obviously, issues of constitutionality. This is something that's in the court system now. So we're going to be dropping an episode specifically looking at HISA and dealing with that on the next Win Place Show. Also, remember, check out my Capping the Card on Aqueduct. That's going to be dropping later this week, and all of the other great content on Trust the Profits. And the best way to get that is to subscribe to Trust the Profits and to follow me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace. Well, until next time, friends, I wish you a prosperous day at the track and remind you that it's now post time.